The last thing anyone expected to see pulling a man from death's grip wasn't a rescuer, wasn't a comrade, wasn't even a human at all. It was a battered shape covered in rain and mud, fighting through chaos when everyone else had turned away, teeth bared not in violence but in defiance of fate itself. And if you think loyalty only belongs to those who wear a uniform, you're about to be proven wrong in a way you'll never forget. Because this isn't a story about heroes you recognize. This is a story about the ones you overlook, the ones you underestimate, the ones who never stop believing even when the whole world did. So if a part of you still believes in loyalty deeper than blood, in courage that doesn't care what you look like or where you come from, stay with us. Like this video if it moves something in you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories that remind you the world still has teeth and heart in all the right places. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were there? And where are you watching from today? We'd love to hear your story too. The wind howled across the vast expanse of Granite Ridge National Park, rattling the windows of the tiny ranger station where Evan Hart adjusted the straps of his battered backpack. His boots scuffed against the worn wooden floor as he paced anxiously, feeling the restless energy crawling under his skin. Outside, the peaks loomed sharp and gray against the winter sky, their faces dusted with the season's early frost. Evan was 23, a rookie ranger barely 2 weeks into his assignment, and already he felt caged by the endless paperwork, the mandatory safety briefings, and the constant sideways glances from older rangers who still saw him as the kid. When the radio crackled to life, announcing that a set of trail cameras had gone offline near the cliff region, nobody volunteered. The temperature was dropping fast. A cold front was moving in, and nightfall came early this time of year. Fixing cameras meant slogging through treacherous terrain, camping overnight in the bitter cold, and returning exhausted and half-frozen. The senior rangers exchanged knowing smirks, expecting the duty to be assigned to Evan by default. But before the captain could even finish his half-hearted suggestion, Evan stepped forward. "I'll take it," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a blade. They stared at him, mildly amused, but Evan only shrugged and grabbed his gear. Anything was better than another mind-numbing day filing reports in that claustrophobic station. He had joined the service to be out there under the open sky, amidst the towering pines, breathing the wild air. If it meant freezing his ass off on a lonely cliff, so be it. By late afternoon, Evan was bouncing along a narrow service trail in one of the park's battered off-road vehicles. The farther he drove, the more alive he felt. The forests grew denser, the shadows deeper, the smell of pine and damp earth rich and intoxicating. He stopped several times to check maps and landmarks. The cliff region was notorious for hidden crevices and sudden drop-offs. The last stretch had to be done on foot. Slinging his pack onto his back, Evan set off up the rugged incline, boots crunching over the gravel and brittle grass. The wind sharpened as he gained altitude, biting through his jacket and numbing his fingers, but he pressed on, determined. When he finally reached the cluster of trail cameras, he crouched down to inspect them, his gloved hands moving methodically. It didn't take long to find the problem. One of the main support cables had been snapped clean through. Frowning, Evan traced the damaged line, his breath misting in the air. At first, he assumed it was weather. Ice can be brutal on exposed cables. But as he leaned closer, a different story began to reveal itself. The cable hadn't just snapped, it had been shredded. Deep gouges and ragged tears lined the insulation, as if some desperate creature had clawed and gnawed at it. Evan's pulse quickened. Bears? Coyotes? Maybe even a mountain lion. None of them, as far as he knew, behaved like this around metal and rubber. A chill, unrelated to the cold, slithered down his spine. He surveyed the area carefully, noting scratch marks in the surrounding dirt, fur caught on a low-hanging branch, short, coarse, and strangely pale. Something had been here, something frantic. He glanced toward the looming cliffs nearby, a sudden unease stirring in his chest. Dusk was falling fast, the sky bled from gray to deep violet, and the first stars winked coldly into existence. Evan secured the repaired cables as best he could, but decided against heading straight back. He needed to know what had caused this. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, gnawed at him. That night, he set up camp in a small clearing shielded from the worst of the wind. His tent shivered with each gust, and the fire he managed to coax alive was little more than a defiant spark against the dark. He sat cross-legged near the flames, sipping lukewarm coffee from a battered thermos, his thoughts circling like vultures. Out here, miles from the nearest outpost, the forest felt ancient and indifferent. Evan should have been exhausted after the climb, the repairs, the biting cold, but adrenaline kept him awake. Something was wrong out here. And somehow he knew this was only the beginning. As he lay back on his sleeping bag, staring up through the thin fabric of his tent at the shifting shadows above, Evan felt it again. A tension in the air like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, a low, mournful sound carried on the wind too distant to identify, yet impossible to ignore. Evan closed his eyes, the echo of it threading into his dream. The cold was unrelenting, seeping through every layer of Evan Hart's clothing as he awoke to the pale gray light of early dawn. His fingers were stiff with frost despite the gloves, his breath a steady cloud in the icy air inside his tent. He sat up slowly, his joints aching from a night spent tossing and turning against the frozen ground. Outside, the fire had long since died, leaving only a pile of blackened embers surrounded by brittle frost. Evan rubbed his arms briskly, feeling the sharp sting of circulation returning, and poked his head out of the tent flap. The mountains stood silent and ominous under a muted sky, the treetops swaying lazily in the biting breeze. Today, he thought he would pack up and head back to base. His mission was complete, the cameras were repaired, and the strange claw marks, though unsettling, hadn't led to any immediate danger. Best not to overstay his welcome in this merciless wilderness. He moved methodically, breaking camp with the precision that had been drilled into him during training. Each motion, though practiced, felt heavier than it should have been, as if the mountains themselves weighed on him, urging him to leave. Slipping the final strap onto his pack, Evan rose to his feet and gave the surroundings a last lingering glance. That was when he heard it. A sound barely louder than the whispering wind, yet it snagged his attention like a hook. He froze, head tilted, heart hammering. There it was again, a faint, broken whimper, carried by the gusts from the direction of the cliffs. Instinct took over before thought could intervene. Evan dropped his pack and scrambled for his binoculars, adjusting the focus with numb fingers. He swept the rocky ledges carefully, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. The landscape was jagged and harsh, shadows pooling in crevices, making it easy to imagine things that weren't there. For a long moment there was nothing, just wind, stones, the relentless emptiness of the cliffs. Then, he saw it. Not a mountain lion, not a coyote, not even a struggling lynx as his mind had first feared. It was a dog, a lone, battered dog wedged precariously between two sharp slabs of rock near the cliff's edge. Its fur, matted and filthy, was a ghostly pale color, almost blending into the frost-laced stone. One of its hind legs was twisted unnaturally, pinned tight in the crevice, and every so often, its body shuddered with a feeble attempt to move. Evan's heart clenched painfully at the sight. The dog's head was lowered, ears pinned back in terror, and despite the agony it must have been feeling, it didn't bark or howl. It only whimpered, soft and broken, as if it had long since learned that no one would come. For a split second, Evan hesitated, logic battling the surge of emotion in his chest. The terrain was treacherous, the descent dangerous even for a trained climber with full gear, which Evan decidedly did not have on hand. Every manual and safety protocol he had ever read flashed through his mind, urging caution, emphasizing the cardinal rule, never attempt a cliff rescue alone. But the sound, the raw, pleading sound sliced through every rational thought. Slinging his pack back onto the ground, Evan tightened his boots, double-checked his rope, and scanned the rocky slope for any possible path. His mind raced, calculating angles, distances, footholds. The dog had no time for his doubts. The whimpers were growing weaker, the temperature was still dropping. Survival wasn't guaranteed out here for any of them. Evan moved quickly but cautiously, lowering himself down a narrow trail that skirted dangerously close to the precipice. Pebbles skittered away under his weight, bouncing off into the abyss below. His gloved hands gripped whatever solid surfaces he could find, boots seeking purchase on the frost-slicked rock. Every step was a gamble, but he pushed forward, driven by something stronger than fear. As he drew closer, the dog lifted its head slightly, one eye swollen shut, The other, a vivid, desperate gold that locked onto Evan's face with heartbreaking intensity. There was no growl, no snap of teeth, only a fragile, flickering hope. Evan spoke softly, not sure if the dog could even hear him over the wind. "Easy, buddy, I'm coming." He edged closer, heart-pounding, muscles taut. One wrong move and they could both go over the side. He uncoiled his rope, secured one end to a nearby jut of rock, and slowly lowered himself to the ledge where the dog lay trapped. The closer he got, the worse the injury appeared. Blood had frozen in patches around the trapped limb. The fur caked in ice and mud. The paw was grotesquely swollen, the leg at a sickening angle. Evan felt bile rise in his throat but swallowed it down. There was no time for weakness. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a compact multi-tool, his hands working quickly to chip away at the stone trapping the dog's leg. Each movement sent tremors through the creature's body. But it didn't struggle, only whimpered once more, a soft, heart-wrenching sound. Evan murmured reassurances under his breath, a steady stream of words that barely registered even to himself. Inch by inch, he loosened the rocks, clearing the pressure. Finally, with a desperate tug, the leg came free. The dog collapsed against the ground, too weak to move, too broken to even attempt escape. Evan carefully bundled the frail body against his chest, wrapping it in the spare blanket he kept in his pack. The dog was terrifyingly light, little more than skin and bone beneath the matted fur. Cradling the injured animal, Evan turned his face toward the sheer climb back to safety, steeling himself. The hardest part was still ahead. Evan hard tightened his grip on the frayed rope, his muscles burning with strain as he began the careful climb back up toward the ridge, cradling the injured dog tightly against his chest beneath the protection of his thick jacket. Each foothold seemed less stable than the last, the crumbling rock threatening to betray him at every step, and the frigid wind howled louder now, roaring up the cliff face like some ancient spirit of the mountain. Evan's breath came hard and fast, pluming visibly into the frozen air as his boots scraped and slipped against the treacherous stone. He gritted his teeth, feeling the exhausted tremors shaking through his arms, and reminded himself that turning back was not an option. He could not leave the dog to die, not after coming this far. The rope was his lifeline, his one fragile connection to safety, and he trusted it with a blind, desperate faith. But trust, in these mountains, was a dangerous currency. As Evan reached for his next hold, there was a sharp, sickening snap, a vibration that shot up the rope into his hands. For one horrifying second, everything seemed to freeze. The cliff, the sky, even his heartbeat. Then the world lurched violently. The rope sheared apart above him with a sound like tearing cloth, and Evan fell, gravity seizing him like a vengeful god. The sensation was immediate and brutal, the air rushing past his ears, the jagged rocks blurring in his peripheral vision as he clutched the dog tighter to his chest, instinctively twisting his body to shield it from the inevitable impact. Time stretched and warped, a surreal, soundless moment suspended in sheer terror. He hit something hard, but not the deadly bottom he had expected. Instead, Evan's body slammed onto a narrow ledge hidden by the curve of the cliff, knocking the air from his lungs and sending an explosion of pain through his ribs and shoulder. He lay there stunned, the world tilting crazily around him, as the dog whimpered weakly in his arms. Somewhere above, the broken end of the rope flapped uselessly against the stone, mocking his trust, his plan. It could have ended there. It should have ended there. But fate, it seemed, had other ideas. Blinking away the tears of pain and panic that clouded his vision, Evan slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the screaming protests of his battered body. The ledge he had landed on was narrow but surprisingly stable, a shelf of ancient rock jutting out from the cliff face like a secret pathway. More astonishingly, when he dared to look along its length, Evan realized it sloped downward at a shallow angle, winding along the cliffside like a hidden trail carved by the hands of time itself. It led almost miraculously straight toward the spot where he had first spotted the trapped dog from above. For a long moment, Evan simply sat there, stunned, listening to the wind howl above him, the dog's shallow breathing loud against his chest. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the terror and the pain, a spark of grim determination flared to life. The mountain had tried to kill him and failed. He would not let it take this dog as consolation. Shifting the bundle of injured fur and bone carefully against his side, Evan rose shakily to his feet. His legs trembled, partly from adrenaline, partly from the shock of the fall, but he forced them to steady, planting his boots firmly on the uneven stone. Step by cautious step, he began making his way along the hidden trail, every muscle screaming in protest, every nerve alive with fear. The path was treacherous, littered with loose gravel and slick patches of ice, and the cliff face yawned hungrily to his left. One misstep would mean a second fall, one he was unlikely to survive. Yet Evan moved with a single-minded focus, his entire world reduced to the narrow band of stone beneath his boots and the precious, fragile life he carried. He spoke to the dog in a low, steady voice as he moved, words meant as much for himself as for the trembling creature in his arms. "Hang in there, buddy. We're almost there, just a little further." His voice was hoarse and raw, stripped of all pretense, a man bargaining with the universe one step at a time. As the trail curved inward toward the cliffside, Evan found himself ducking beneath overhangs of frozen stone, the icicles dripping like knives overhead. His breath came in ragged gasps now. Every inch gained a small, hard-won victory. Somewhere above, the storm clouds thickened, casting the landscape into a premature twilight. Snowflakes began to fall in slow, lazy spirals, dusting the rocks with a deceptive layer of treachery. Evan wiped the moisture from his lashes with the back of his glove, refusing to be blinded now. Not now, not when he was so close. The narrow trail widened slightly, opening onto a small, sheltered alcove carved into the cliffside. And Evan's heart gave a fierce lurch. Nestled against the rock, half hidden by a drift of snow, was the spot where he had first seen the dog trapped. The ledge here was broader, more forgiving, and Evan staggered toward it, his body operating on sheer willpower alone. He collapsed to his knees beside the dog, shielding it from the wind with his own body as he assessed the situation. The injured limb was in worse condition than he had feared, swollen grotesquely and turning a sickly purple beneath the dirty fur. Evan's stomach twisted at the sight, but he pushed the nausea down, focusing instead on the essentials. Stabilize, warm, protect. His hands moved automatically, years of training kicking in even as exhaustion gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He had made it this far, but they were not safe yet, not by a long shot. The path back was still treacherous, and the storm was only growing stronger. Evan knew he couldn't linger here long. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and hypothermia was no longer a distant threat. It was a rapidly approaching certainty. He needed to find shelter. He needed to get them both off this cursed mountain. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that he had already pushed his luck too far, that the mountain would not grant him a second miracle. But Evan Hart had never been good at listening to voices that told him to give up. Evan Hart tightened his jacket around the fragile body of the injured dog, shielding it from the whipping snow and the rising wind that clawed at the mountainside like a living thing. His hands were numb and clumsy with cold, but he moved with a desperate tenderness, careful not to jostle the shattered leg or the thin ribs he could feel beneath the dog's filthy fur. The animal didn't fight him, didn't growl or snap out of instinct or fear. It simply lay limp against his chest, trusting him with a purity that pierced Evan's heart sharper than any blade. That trust was unsettling in its intensity, an unspoken surrender from a creature that had every reason to expect only cruelty from the world. Evan felt the weight of it, heavier than the storm pressing against his back, heavier than the mountain looming above. He adjusted his grip, murmuring soft, meaningless reassurances into the dog's matted ear as he began the long, arduous climb back along the treacherous hidden trail. Each step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion, his muscles screaming in protest, his boots slipping dangerously on the ice-slicked stones. But he didn't slow, didn't falter, because somewhere deep in the marrow of his bones he knew that stopping was not an option. The dog's breathing was shallow and rapid against his chest, a trembling pulse of life that seemed to sync with his own battered heartbeat. Snow clung to them both, a thin, icy shell that threatened to freeze them together into a single tragic monument to failure. Evan gritted his teeth and pushed on, speaking to the dog more for his own sanity than anything else, his voice low and hoarse against the howling wind. "Almost there, buddy, just hold on a little longer. You're not alone anymore." The words were a promise he intended to keep, no matter the cost. By the time he finally stumbled back to the spot where he had abandoned his gear hours ago, Evan's legs were shaking so badly he nearly collapsed. He dropped to one knee, shielding the dog with his body as he fumbled with frozen fingers to retrieve his emergency blanket and a small collapsible carrier from his pack. Wrapping the animal securely, he tucked it into the carrier with infinite care, layering it with every scrap of insulation he could spare. The dog whimpered softly but made no attempt to escape, its golden eye fixed on him with a steady, soul-deep gaze that seemed to anchor him against the rising tide of panic and fatigue threatening to pull him under. Evan slung the carrier carefully over one shoulder, tightened every strap on his pack, and began the slow, torturous hike back toward the rough trail that would eventually lead him down the mountain. It felt like moving through molasses, every step a monumental effort, but he forced himself onward, driven by the tiny, stubborn ember of hope that refused to die inside him. Hours blurred into one another, the landscape shifting from jagged cliffs to dense forest to the barely navigable service road where he had left the park's battered off-road vehicle. By the time Evan reached it, he was staggering, barely coherent with exhaustion and cold, but he managed to secure the carrier safely inside before collapsing behind the wheel. His hands shook so badly he could barely turn the ignition, but the engine roared to life on the third try, a rough, defiant sound that brought tears of relief to his eyes. He cranked the heater to maximum and peeled off his wet gloves, flexing his fingers painfully as he checked on the dog. It lay curled in the carrier, its chest rising and following shallowly, but there was a flicker of awareness in its eye that hadn't been there before, a spark of cautious hope. Evan offered it a weak smile and whispered, "Hang in there, partner. We're not done yet." The drive back to the ranger station was a blur of ice-slick roads, blinding snow, and the constant gnawing fear that the dog wouldn't survive the journey. Evan kept one eye on the road and one on the bundle beside him, speaking to it in a steady stream of nonsense meant to keep them both anchored to the world of the living. When he finally skidded into the station's parking lot, he didn't waste time grabbing more gear. He scooped up the carrier and rushed inside, kicking the door open with a frozen boot. The inside of the station was blissfully warm compared to the storm outside, but Evan barely noticed. His entire focus was on the injured animal in his arms. He cleared a space on the emergency cot they kept for overnight shifts, laying out blankets and heating packs with frantic efficiency. Only when he unwrapped the dog from the carrier did he notice something odd. Beneath the grime and the tangled mats of fur, the dog's abdomen was swollen, unnaturally round and firm. For a moment, Evan thought it was another injury, some internal bleeding or worse, and his heart lurched with fresh panic. But as he gently probed the area, the realization struck him like a thunderbolt. The dog wasn't just injured, she was pregnant. He sat back on his heels, staring in stunned disbelief at the creature he had risked his life to save. Not just one life, he thought dazedly, but several. She shifted weakly, her golden eye meeting his, and in that gaze Evan read not fear or pain or even gratitude, but a fierce, stubborn will to survive, to protect the lives growing inside her at any cost. Evan scrubbed a hand over his face, forcing his racing mind into focus. Everything had changed. His responsibility wasn't just to her anymore. It was to the tiny, unborn lives she carried, fragile as candle flames in a storm. He rose to his feet, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a fierce new determination. He would find a way to save her. He would find a way to save them all. The realization that the injured dog was pregnant hit Evan's heart with a jolt of renewed urgency, forcing him into motion even though every fiber of his body screamed for rest. He wrapped her once more in the emergency blanket, layered her against the heating packs, and rushed to load her carefully back into the carrier. There was no time to waste. The ranger station's supplies were minimal, meant for human injuries or short-term care, not for an injured pregnant animal fighting for her life in the dead of winter. He grabbed the radio and called in to the main veterinary outpost, his voice tight with worry as he relayed the situation. Static crackled back at him for a moment before a voice responded, professional but detached. Evan explained everything, how he had found her, her injuries, the pregnancy, and begged for immediate assistance. But the reply that came was cold, clinical, and final. "We do not have the capacity to accept wild, unregistered animals at this time." Given the condition and lack of identification, Euthanasia is recommended to prevent prolonged suffering. The words hit Evan harder than the fall he had taken from the cliff. He stood there frozen, the weight of their indifference slamming into him like a punch to the gut. Euthanasia ended cleanly, conveniently, because it was easier than fighting for her life. His hands clenched into fists around the radio, his breath coming in harsh, jagged bursts. No, not after everything she had endured. Not after the way she had looked at him with that strange, unwavering trust. Not while there was still the slightest sliver of hope. Without another word, Evan slammed the radio back into its holder and scooped up the carrier again. He wasn't giving up. If the official channels wouldn't help, then he would do it himself. He wrestled the station's emergency vehicle into gear once more and tore down the snow-slick roads toward his assigned cabin deep within the park's boundaries. The cabin was little more than a glorified shack with no running water, minimal heating, a generator that sputtered more often than it roared, but it would have to do. As he drove, Evan talked to her again, promising things he wasn't sure he could deliver but needed to believe in anyway. Just hold on, girl, we're gonna figure this out. You're not alone. His voice cracked from the strain and the cold, but he kept talking, kept driving, kept fighting the growing panic that threatened to paralyze him. When he reached the cabin, Evan didn't hesitate. He bundled the dog out of the vehicle and into the small, dimly lit space, setting up a makeshift infirmary with every spare blanket, jacket, and bit of insulation he could find. He got a fire roaring in the old wood stove, the heat filling the cramped room with a rough, choking warmth that barely pushed back the cold. He boiled water over the fire, sterilized what little equipment he had, laid out towels and old shirts as bedding. The dog, whom he now instinctively thought of as Sage, whimpered softly, but didn't fight as he settled her on the pile of makeshift bedding near the fire. Evan crouched beside her, stroking her head gently, murmuring low reassurances as he checked her condition. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling violently despite the growing warmth. And then, with a low, broken moan, the first contraction hit. Evan's stomach twisted into knots as he realized what was happening. She was going into labor, right here, right now, hours from any professional help, with only him, an exhausted, half-frozen rookie ranger, to stand between her and death. Fear clawed at him, but he shoved it aside. Sage needed him. Her puppies needed him. He couldn't afford to freeze now. He rolled up his sleeves, scrubbed his hands clean with the boiling water, and prepared for the worst. The first puppy was born after what felt like an eternity, a tiny, slick bundle that slid into Evan's trembling hands. It wasn't moving. Evan worked quickly, rubbing the pup with a clean cloth, clearing its mouth. After agonizing seconds, it gave a feeble, gasping squeak, and Evan almost cried with relief. He placed the puppy gently against Sage's side, encouraging it to nurse. But even as he did, he could see the warning signs. The pup's breathing was ragged and shallow, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. A second puppy came next, then a third, each one smaller and frailer than the last. Evan repeated the process for each, desperate, frantic, operating on pure instinct and adrenaline. The room was filled with the sounds of panting, whimpering, and the low crackle of the fire, and through it all, Evan's heart hammered a single desperate refrain: survive, survive, survive. But as he sat back on his heels, surveying the fragile, struggling bundles of life nestled against Sage's trembling body, a sick fear settled deep in his gut. They were too small, too weak. Their lungs, he realized with dawning horror, were underdeveloped. None of them might survive the night. He pressed a hand over his mouth, feeling the hot sting of helplessness behind his eyes. He couldn't lose them, not after everything. Not like this. The fire popped and crackled behind him, throwing long, flickering shadows across the cramped cabin walls, as Evan huddled closer to the tiny family he had fought so hard to save, steeling himself for the long, brutal night ahead. The fire crackled weakly in the corner of the cabin, casting a dim, wavering light over the exhausted figure of Evan Hart as he knelt beside the fragile forms nestled against Sage's side. 3 tiny lives, each no larger than his hand, struggled for breath, their tiny chests rising and falling in shallow, uneven rhythms that seemed to mock his desperate hope. Evan's hands trembled as he prepared another syringe of formula. The milk warmed carefully to mimic the lost heat of a mother's natural nursing. Every step of the process learned from frantic glances at a battered field manual and sheer gut instinct. He had not slept in almost 36 hours, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on him like a physical force. But he shoved it aside with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He had made them a promise in the cold darkness of that first night, and he would not let them down. One by one, he fed them, using a tiny rubber tube attached to the syringe to drip the life-saving nourishment into their barely functioning bodies. Each puppy fought him weakly at first, their mouths too small, their instincts too feeble, and Evan's heart broke a little more with every drop spilled. He coaxed them, whispered to them, begged them, until they accepted the nourishment, their tiny tongues flickering with desperate need. The first night blurred into the second, and Evan's world shrank to the tiny circle of light around the fire. The rhythmic task of feeding, cleaning, massaging their tiny sides to stimulate breathing and digestion. His own body rebelled, muscles cramping, eyes burning, hands raw and clumsy, but he refused to stop. He forced himself upright every time he sagged against the wall, slapped himself awake every time his vision darkened at the edges. He lost track of how many times he nearly passed out, his body begging for rest he could not afford to give. Sage watched him with tired, grateful eyes, too weak herself to help but offering silent companionship in the brutal fight for survival. Evan spoke to the puppies constantly, his voice hoarse and cracked from dehydration and fatigue, weaving them stories about the great forests they would one day run through, the rivers they would splash across, the open skies they would chase each other under. He spoke life into them, daring the universe to take them from him. The third night came like a hammer blow, and Evan barely managed to boil the formula and prepare the syringes before collapsing against the hearth, his mind fogged and broken from exhaustion. He jerked awake moments later, instinct alone propelling him toward the puppies, checking their breathing, their heartbeats, counting each precious inhale and exhale with the desperation of a drowning man counting seconds of air. One puppy, the smallest, the one he had named Ash, in his mind shuddered violently in his hands, its breathing stuttering, and Evan's heart seized in terror. He bent over it, whispering frantic encouragements, gently stroking its tiny body, forcing the warm milk into its reluctant mouth one trembling drop at a time. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Evan couldn't tell anymore. Time was a meaningless river, dragging him along without mercy. He fed them, cleaned them, cradled them, his own life bleeding out into the fire, into the tiny fragile lives clinging to existence. Somewhere deep inside, a dark voice whispered that it wasn't enough, that he had failed, that the mountain had finally claimed its due. Evan's head drooped, his hands cradling Ash's limp body, the fire a dying ember in the corner of his blurred vision. He was slipping, losing the battle, sinking into a darkness too deep to claw his way out of. And then, through the suffocating silence, a sound shattered the night. A bark, small, ragged, barely more than a wheeze, but unmistakable. Evan's eyes snapped open, heart lurching painfully against his ribs. He lifted his head, searching the dim room until he found the source. It was River, the second-born, her tiny mouth open, her fragile body shuddering with the effort of that first defiant sound. Another bark followed, softer but clear as Soul stirred beside her, a ripple of life sparking through the huddled trio. Evan's heart exploded with a raw, ragged joy that left him gasping. Tears flooded his eyes, hot and blinding, and he laughed a broken, choking sound as he gathered the three puppies into his arms, holding them close to his chest where they could feel the steady, stubborn beat of his heart. Against all odds, they had fought their way back from the brink, clawed their way out of the shadow of death, to claim the life he had promised them. He pressed his forehead against their warm, wriggling bodies, whispering thanks to whatever merciful force had heard his prayers. The fire roared back to life in the hearth behind him, casting the cabin in a golden glow as if the universe itself were exhaling in relief. Evan didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the puppies would grow strong or falter again. But for this moment, for this breathless, miraculous moment, they were alive, and so was he. The days that followed blurred into a quiet, rhythmic battle for life, a series of small, miraculous victories stitched together by Evan Hart's relentless will and the stubborn tenacity of the puppies he had fought so hard to save. Little by little, Ash, River, and Soul grew stronger, their ribs no longer so painfully visible beneath their scruffy coats. their lungs filling the cabin with tiny, fierce barks that filled Evan's heart with a pride he could not put into words. Sage, too, recovered with a determination that mirrored her puppy's, her wounds healing into faint scars beneath new fur, her golden eye watching Evan with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something almost human in its comprehension. Spring came slowly to Granite Ridge, the snow retreating inch by reluctant inch, replaced by the first tentative blooms of hardy mountain flowers and the soft burble of newly freed streams. Evan knew, as the world thawed and came alive again, that the time was approaching when he would have to do the hardest thing he had ever done: let them go. Wild creatures, even ones who had been nursed through death's doorway by human hands, belonged to the wild, not to the warmth of a cabin or the safety of a man's heart. He had always known this, but knowing did not make it any easier. He spent their last weeks together preparing them for the life that awaited them beyond the edge of the clearing. He taught them to track scents through the thick underbrush, to move silently when danger threatened. Sage led them in mock hunts, her body sleek and strong once more, her movements teaching more than Evan's words ever could. The puppies no longer helpless, mewling bundles but lithe, energetic shadows thrived under her tutelage, their energy contagious, their laughter infectious. Evan laughed with them, ran with them, loved them with a moment borrowed against the inevitable. On the morning he could no longer postpone, Evan rose before the sun, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He packed what little he had into the old Ranger Jeep, the carrier for the ride, some strips of dried meat for the journey, a tattered blanket that still smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the long nights spent fighting for their survival. Sage and the pups sensed something was different. They were quiet as he loaded them, their usual rambunctious energy muted by a tension that mirrored his own. The drive to the release site of the deep, protected valley on the far side of the park was mercifully short, but Evan wished it were longer, wished he could stretch these last few minutes into hours, into days. The valley was perfect. Dense woods, clean water, abundant prey, a place where they could thrive, where their story could continue without him. Evan parked at the trailhead and carried the carrier to the clearing, setting it down with trembling hands. He knelt there for a long moment, the wind whispering through the pines, the morning light painting everything in soft gold. His throat burned with unshed tears, but he forced a smile as he unlatched the door. Ash tumbled out first, his nose twitching excitedly at the scent of freedom, followed closely by River and Soul, their tails high, their bodies vibrating with anticipation. Sage stepped out last, her movements slower, more deliberate. She turned to Evan, her gaze steady and impossibly deep, and for a moment time froze. Evan knelt before her, one hand resting on her scarred shoulder, and whispered, "Be free, be safe, remember." He did not know if she understood the words, but he knew she understood the meaning. Sage leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against his before stepping back, her golden eye never leaving his. Then she turned, a queen leading her young into a new kingdom, and padded into the forest, her puppies bounding joyfully around her. Evan watched them go, his heart breaking and mending all at once. Every step they took away from him a tearing and a healing. He thought they were gone when the trees swallowed their forms. But then, just before the last flicker of her pale coat disappeared, Sage turned. She stood there for a long moment, silhouetted against the dappled green, her gaze locked onto Evan with a weight that rooted him to the earth. It was not a goodbye, not really. It was a promise, a silent vow stitched into the very fabric of the morning, that what they had shared would not be forgotten, that some bonds once forged could never truly be broken. Evan raised a hand, and Sage dipped her head once, a regal, solemn motion before vanishing into the wild with her children at her heel. Years slipped by like leaves caught in a restless river, carrying Evan Hart further from that bittersweet morning in the clearing, yet never truly washing it from his soul. In the seasons that followed, he threw himself into his work with a quiet ferocity that did not go unnoticed, rising through the ranks until the day he was handed the insignia that marked him as captain of the Granite Ridge Rangers. It should have been a moment of pride, and in a way it was, but the title felt hollow compared to the memory of a golden-eyed dog and 3 scrappy puppies disappearing into the wild. Evan wore his new authority lightly, preferring the company of the mountains to the endless meetings and paperwork that came with leadership. His heart remained tethered to the forests and the rivers, the snowfields and the hidden valleys, as if some part of him still wandered with Sage and her brood. He patrolled the trails personally whenever he could, boots on the ground, eyes sharp for signs of trouble, his spirit restless and uncontainable. When the rains came, they came without mercy, drenching the world in a deluge so fierce it seemed the mountains themselves might be washed away. Evan was out inspecting river crossings when the first warning signs appeared. The sullen roar of saturated earth shifting, the shiver of ground beneath his feet, the panicked scattering of birds rising like a black cloud against the gray sky. He barely had time to radio in a garbled warning before the world broke apart around him. The hillside above the trail gave way with a thunderous crack, a wall of mud, rocks, and shattered trees cascading down with a speed and force that defied comprehension. Evan turned to run, but the ground betrayed him, his boots losing traction in the sucking mire, and in an instant he was caught, swallowed by the churning chaos. The mudslide tore the breath from his lungs, battered him with debris, pinned him beneath a suffocating, crushing weight. He fought instinctively, clawing for purchase, for air, for life, but the mud was relentless, pulling him down like some monstrous hand. His world shrank to a blind, choking panic, each gasp a battle, each heartbeat a defiance. Pain flared in his side, his shoulder, somewhere deep inside his chest, but it was the cold that frightened him more, the numbing, creeping cold that seeped into his bones, whispering that it would be easier to let go. Time lost meaning in that half-buried tomb of earth and stone. Evan drifted between lucidity and darkness, the roaring of the rain and the groaning of the wounded forest blurring into a single, relentless noise. He thought of many things in those suspended moments. The smell of pine smoke in his cabin, the sharp, joyous bark of ash chasing River through the underbrush, the steady, fierce gaze of Sage promising things words could never hold. He thought of the lives he had saved and the ones he had lost, and wondered if, in the end, it would all balance out. He was so tired, so cold. He almost didn't notice the shift in the air, the subtle disturbance that prickled against his skin. A shadow moved at the edge of his fading vision, something that was not mud or rain or broken tree limbs. Evan forced his eyes open, blinking against the muck and the rain, and saw through a haze of pain and disbelief a shape emerging from the chaos. A dog. Not a wild coyote or a lost pet, but a large, powerful dog, coat slick with rain and mud, eyes burning with a fierce, familiar light. It stood on a patch of relatively solid ground just beyond the worst of the slide, its body tense with purpose, its gaze locked onto Evan with an intensity that banished the darkness clawing at the edges of his mind. Evan tried to call out, but his voice was a broken rasp, lost in the storm's fury. He could only watch, hope flickering in his chest like a guttering flame, as the dog stepped closer, carefully, deliberately, testing the ground with each movement. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, as the dog drew nearer, some deep, unshakable part of Evan recognized it, not the individual perhaps, but the spirit, the indelible bond that transcended time and reason. A low whine cut through the roar of the rain, a sound so filled with urgency and recognition that it shattered whatever lingering doubt Evan had. Help was coming somehow against all odds. The dog paused just out of reach, its body quivering with tension, and then lifted its head to the heavens and let out a single, piercing howl, a cry that echoed across the broken landscape like a battle cry, a summons, a promise. Evan closed his eyes, clinging to that sound as the darkness surged again, knowing in his bones that he was not alone, not forgotten, not yet defeated. The howler tore through the storm with a raw, primal power, a sound that reached deep into Evan Hart's failing consciousness and tethered him back to the fragile thread of life he was so close to relinquishing. He forced his heavy eyelids open again, the mud blurring his vision into streaks of brown and gray. But through the haze he saw the dog moving closer, muscles bunching and releasing with fluid strength, every inch of her body alive with purpose and familiarity that stirred something ancient in Evan's battered heart. The golden hue of her eyes, fierce and unyielding against the gloom, pierced him with sudden, stunning clarity, and recognition slammed into him like a tidal wave. Sage. It was Sage, older now, her coat roughened by the years, her frame leaner and battle-hardened, But it was her without question, the same dog he had once cradled in a shivering cabin, the same soul he had freed into the wild that morning so many seasons ago. Evan tried to lift his hand, tried to call her name, but his body betrayed him, trapped under layers of sodden earth and shattered trees. Sage barked sharply, a commanding sound, and from the swirling mist of rain and debris came 3 more figures, smaller, quicker, but unmistakably hers. Ash, River, and Soul, no longer puppies but strong, fierce echoes of the creatures he had nursed through death's doorway, now grown into their full power. The sight of them sent a jolt through Evan's heart that drove back the creeping numbness, replacing despair with a wild, improbable hope. The dogs fanned out instinctively, moving with the fluid coordination of a practiced unit, their bodies low to the ground as they navigated the unstable terrain with a grace Evan could only marvel at even in his dazed state. Sage approached first, her paws sinking into the mud with each careful step, until she stood so close that Evan could see the fine scars lacing her muzzle, the way her breath misted into the rain like smoke. She lowered her head, sniffing at the mud-caked form of the man who had once saved her, and then gave a low, urgent whine that cut straight through the fog in Evan's brain. She remembered. She had come back. Evan felt the tears burning hot against the frozen skin of his cheeks, merging with the rain, and for a moment he simply closed his eyes and breathed, letting the miracle of their presence soak into him like the last warmth of a dying fire. Sage moved with sudden decisiveness, beginning to dig at the mud that pinned Evan's legs, her powerful claws tearing into the heavy, wet earth with a frantic determination. Ash joined her almost immediately, his younger, stronger frame adding speed and strength to the effort, while River circled around, barking sharply into the wind as if calling for human help, her voice slicing through the storm again and again. Saul, the smallest but perhaps the boldest, climbed higher up the ruined slope, scouting, his ears pricked in alert for any sign of rescue teams. Evan wanted to help them, to free himself, but all he could do was watch and cling to consciousness as their frantic work continued. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time meant nothing in that suspended, broken world, but slowly, achingly, he felt the pressure on his chest ease, the weight trapping his arms diminish. His fingers twitched, then curled weakly into the loose mud as Sage and Ash dug and pulled, refusing to let him go. A sudden movement above caught Evan's attention, and through the curtain of rain he saw flashlights, bobbing and weaving as a team of rangers scrambled over the wreckage. Drawn by River's relentless barking, a voice shouted his name, raw with fear and hope, and Evan tried to answer, managing only a broken rasp that was quickly lost to the wind. But it was enough. The rangers surged forward, galvanized by the sight of the dogs working desperately to free their fallen friend. And within moments they were there, digging with shovels and bare hands, lifting away the shattered branches and heavy sodden earth that held Evan prisoner. Through it all, Sage stayed by his side, her body pressed against his in silent solidarity, refusing to leave him even when human hands took over the rescue. Evan felt the rough scrape of a rescue sled beneath him, felt the strong arms securing him with straps and blankets, heard the urgent voices conferring over his injuries. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, possible internal bleeding. Words floated around him like leaves caught in a stream, meaningless except for one immutable truth. He was alive. Alive because they had come for him. Alive because a bond forged in the desperate fires of another long-ago winter had refused to break. As the rangers prepared to move him, Evan managed to turn his head just enough to meet Sage's gaze one more time. Their eyes locked, and in that look was everything words could never say. Gratitude, love, the fierce, stubborn promise that they would never truly be apart, no matter how many seasons passed or storms raged. He wanted to speak, to call her name, to tell her what her return meant, but the world tilted and darkened around him before he could form the words, and he felt himself slipping again, this time not into terror but into a deep, exhausted trust, knowing that whatever happened next, he would not be alone. The world shifted and spun in a disjointed rhythm as Evan Hart drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the rough hands lifting him, the secure tightness of the straps across his chest, and the urgent voices speaking over him with a mixture of fear and relief. The rain still pounded down, soaking him to the bone, but the mudslide was behind him now. The brutal force of nature that had tried to claim him, beaten back by something far stronger than luck. He was alive because of them, because Sage, Ash, River, and Soul had refused to let him go, had fought through storm and terror to find him, to bring help when his own strength had run out. As the rescue sled bumped and jostled over the treacherous ground, Evan's head lolled to the side, and he caught fleeting glimpses of movement at the edges of his vision, 4 shadows weaving in and out of the wreckage, guiding, guarding the rescuers forward with a tireless determination that broke something open in his chest. They didn't stay close enough to be caught or hinder the men, but their presence was undeniable, spirits moving through the storm, part of the mountain itself now, wild and free yet bound to him by something deeper than blood or obligation. He wanted to call out to them, to thank them, but his throat was raw and useless, and so he simply closed his eyes again, surrendering to the darkness with the knowledge that he was safe, that he had been found, that promises made long ago in the firelight of a tiny cabin had been kept with a loyalty that defied explanation. The journey to the hospital blurred into a series of flashing lights, shouted orders, the sharp sting of needles, the steady beep of machines tracking the fragile thread of his life. Evan floated somewhere above it all, his battered body cocooned in warmth and pain and a bone-deep exhaustion that even fear could not penetrate. Time became meaningless, measured only in the slow, patient rhythm of recovery, broken ribs knitting together, bruised lungs drawing deeper breaths, the dislocated shoulder resetting with a jolt that dragged a groan from his battered frame. Through it all, he clung to the memory of Sage's eyes, to the feel of her body pressing against his in the mud, to the fierce certainty that he had not been abandoned. Days passed, he didn't know how many, before he was lucid enough to take stock of his surroundings. The hospital room was small but clean, the walls painted a soft, forgettable blue, the air filled with the antiseptic tang of disinfectant, and the low hum of fluorescent light. A bouquet of wildflowers, awkward and slightly wilted, sat on the table by his bed, a get-well card tucked among them signed by the ranger team. He smiled weakly at the thought, grateful beyond words for their efforts. But it was not them his heart ached to see. He shifted carefully, wincing at the sharp protest of his ribs, and turned his gaze toward the door, half hoping, half dreading. It was closed, of course, the world outside moving on as if it had not nearly lost. Evan's chest tightened, the weight of all he wanted to say pressing hard against his battered ribs. It was enough, he told himself. They had saved him. That was enough. As twilight deepened outside the narrow window, painting the room in dusky gold, Evan thought he heard something, a faint scrabble of claws against linoleum, the soft huff of breath too low and steady to be a nurse or doctor. His heart leapt painfully, his breath catching in his throat as he turned his head sharply toward the door. For a long moment there was nothing, only silence. Then, slowly, almost reverently, the door creaked open an inch. No figure appeared, no familiar face peered in. Instead, just inside the threshold, something else materialized. A single, perfect paw print pressed into the spotless tile, the shape unmistakable, even smeared and laced with flecks of mud. Evan stared at it, his vision blurring with sudden, fierce tears, because he knew without needing to see her, she had come, one last time, to make sure he was safe, to complete the circle they had begun so long ago in the firelit cabin on the edge of the world. She had returned not for thanks or reward, but because it was who she was, because the bond they shared transcended words and time and even the wild freedom she had claimed as her own. He wanted to rise, to stagger to the door, to catch one last glimpse of her and her children before they belonged, but his broken body refused to obey, trapping him in place as the tears slid unchecked down his face. He closed his eyes, pressing a trembling hand to his heart, and in the silence that followed, he imagined them there, Sage, standing proud and strong, Ash and River and Soul flanking her, their golden eyes watching over him with a love as fierce and enduring as the mountains themselves. When the nurse finally entered some time later, bustling with gentle efficiency, the paw print was gone, wiped away like a dream, leaving only Evan's heartbeat thundering in his ears, and the certainty that he had been blessed beyond measure. Sage had kept her promise. She had returned when he needed her most. And now she had gone back to the wild she loved, leaving behind not sorrow but something infinitely stronger. Hope, faith, and a story that would live in his blood forever. Evan turned his face toward the window, watching as the last light of the day faded into stars. And he smiled, broken and whole and endlessly grateful for a world where even the wildest promises could be. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful journeys like this. We'd love to hear what part of Evan and Sage's story touched you the most. Was there a moment that stayed with you? Tell us in the comments. Also, where in the world are you reading from today? Let's see how far this story can travel.